वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे।
In the shadow of the 65-million-year-old Mount Girnar, there lived in the early 15th century one of India's most revered poet-philosophers. Nearly 500 years after he wrote it, one of his songs came to define Mohandas Gandhi's moral universe. It is rare in history that a single song becomes the moral center of one of the world's great political movements. Vaishnav Jan To, or The Truly Righteous One, is that song. Narsinh Mehta, its writer, and Mohandas Gandhi, its most ardent proponent. It is arguably one of the most widely sung songs in the world. This is their story.
If a language creates a song or a poem like Vaishnav Jan, the language does not need to create much more.
He wrote brilliant devotional poetry and profound philosophical ruminations, evocative in language and breathtaking in imagery. However, perhaps there is none that is such a brilliant distillation of the thousands of years of India's ancient wisdom as his song, When I Wake Up.
It speaks of a state of sleep and wakefulness, and the period of transition, where one is awake but yet not awake. One is asleep but not yet asleep.
जागिने 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 जो तो जगत दिसे नहीं, जागिने जो तो जगत दिसे नहीं। ऊँघ माँ अटपटा भोग बासे, ऊँघ माँ अटपटा भोग बासे। जागिने 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 चित चैतन्य विलास तदरूप छै, चित चैतन्य विलास तदरूप छै। ब्रह्म लटका करे ब्रह्म पासे, ब्रह्म लटका करे ब्रह्म पासे। जागिने 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 जो तो जगत दिसे नहीं, ऊँघ माँ अटपटा भोग बासे। जागिने जो तो जगत दिसे नहीं, ऊँघ माँ अटपटा भोग बासे। चित चैतन्य विलास तदरूप छै, ब्रह्म लटका करे ब्रह्म पास। जागिने जागिने जागिने
Not very often does one get a chance to aram se sit down and have a conversation with someone whose views you have really experienced firsthand, because I keep reaching out to this person for his perspectives. But in this case, it's a formal sit-down interview with a journalist, poet, painter, and in this case, the reason for this entire conversation is that he's a filmmaker, someone who has made a film, and probably the only one that at least I know of, which is on a song that happens to be a bit famous because it was an anthem of sorts that was made famous by none other than Mahatma Gandhi. So what's the song that we're talking about? A song that goes Vaishnav Jan To kahiye. And it's a song which a lot of people assume is a Mahatma song. So, about all this and more, let's go straight in and have a hello, Kem Cho conversation with Mayank Chhaya, who's now joining me straight from Chicago. And here I am in Bangalore. Mayank, Kem Cho.
એકદમ મજામાં તમે કેમ છો વસંતી?
હું પણ મજામાં છું. And you are the guy who's going to demystify this song, who many of us think is written by Mahatma Gandhi himself.
Right.
You go ahead and say it in 74 minutes about the saint who actually should be given credit for the song. So tell us a little bit more about Gandhi's song and the film that you have made that premieres very soon.
First of all, thank you, Vasanthi. It's a great pleasure, privilege to talk to someone of your substance and someone of your talent in various media. I've been following you for a while. We've become good friends, and I regard you as a dear friend of mine, and we often interact on various subjects from time to time. It's an awkward thing to be in this formal setting. That's why I'm glad you're calling it a conversation. So thank you so much for your time and enthusiasm about this. Let me, Narsinh Mehta. Narsinh Mehta is an icon in Gujarat. Gujaratis know Narsinh Mehta almost instinctively. Narsinh Mehta is not known much outside Gujarat at all, for various reasons. The main being that he wrote, obviously, primarily in Gujarati. And wrote is a bit of a misnomer because he was an oral poet, largely. He was reputed to be unlettered. So he constructed his poetry, hundreds of ballads and songs, in a way that, with a cadence that it could be sung. And singing leads to oral transmission in a much easier way than a written word might. So that's his quick background. He was born in 1414 and he died in 1480. These are the most widely accepted dates, although there is some dispute about when he was born and when he died. Yeah. But scholars regard this to be his period. So I give this date for the simple reason that it has a context to my documentary. Gandhi was born in 1869. So you're talking about someone who died about 4 centuries before Gandhi was born.
Yeah.
And by the time Gandhi was born, Narsinh Mehta was already the most celebrated Adi Kavi, as they call it in Gujarat. He is the pioneering poet of Gujarat, who in fact invented Gujarati poetic meter in many ways.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of what Gujarati poets write is often derived from the way Narsinh Mehta constructed his poetry. And the interesting part, as I was saying, is that since he was largely unlettered by reputation, that's not been confirmed, but my reading is that he was. It's amazing that someone unlettered could create something which was so structured.
That's right. In fact, it is intriguing, Mayank, and your film and me having had the privilege to have a sneak preview of the film itself is when I was watching that, I was surprised that given the background, though he did come from a higher caste and probably the highest caste, the Nagars of the time, first of all, for that caste and for him to be unlettered was, to me as an outsider, a bit of a surprise. But then your film also shows about how the circumstances under which he was born mute, as the film suggests. And then, of course, there are personal tragedies. There are taunts from his family, particularly his sister-in-law, as it mentioned. So I'm guessing that there was a situation around him which probably forced him to stay unlettered in one sense, and at the same time his own evolution and this innate wisdom that the man has, the saint has, and clearly there is definitely this divine element. And then you see the song that you have known, or have hummed, and in school prayers, you've heard it on Doordarshan, and I continue to start my day even on Tamil television, by the way, with Vaishnav Jan To, that is played out in the instrumental version. Doordarshan across all channels plays this, and I urge even whoever is watching, going to be watching this interview, to look up the online version. It is just so you cannot not be moved by it, and that comes from a place of this saint, this poet, as you mentioned, who was illiterate, so to speak, but that song. Who can even believe that this man never really was schooled, right? So, and there's just so much of wisdom packed into that. Tene kahiye je peed parai jane. I mean, it's almost the Indian philosophy thought all crunched into one line and one paragraph, as it were, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, interesting, you should mention that. This is my personal speculation, which has no basis in reality, but my impulsive, intuitive feel is that Narsinh Mehta as a child would have been someone who would be regarded in this country as a gifted child. And gifted child in the sense they are officially recognized as gifted children. There are special programs in America for children who perform well above their the normal level. In Narsinh Mehta's case, and gifted children are known to drift away from the traditional course. They get bored very quickly. They cannot pay much attention to the normal way things are done. My suspicion, even as I'm talking to you, I've thought about it, is that perhaps he was a gifted child at that point, notwithstanding that he had problems talking early on, like Einstein, I suppose. Einstein had a similar problem.
Yeah.
In terms of, I think it was perhaps in the air of Junagadh, where he was not born in Junagadh, but he was born in a place called Taraja, which is a coastal town near Bhavnagar. It's a lovely place to visit. Stunning sunsets and sunrises. It's a pretty place. I think my suspicion once again is that he was deeply influenced by some of those elements. For instance, there is a little hill which is essentially lava frozen, where there is a cave which is a Buddhist cave. I went inside that cave as part of my filming, and I was told by people who know these things that Narsinh Mehta would have begun constructing some of his writing right inside in that cave. So he was, I think, quite naturally in commune with the elements from very early on. And fortunately, he had, as it were, a gift of the gab to construct what he had in mind.
I think, Mayank, when we examine the tradition of bhakti poetry in Indian, the spiritual systems, or even in history, we find poets like Surdas,
right,
who was born blind, who was in today's parlance visually impaired. But if you were to examine all his poetry, or even a thing such as Maiya Mori Main Nahi Makhan Khayo, that line, where in fact that entire poetry, which plays out between this child and the mother, and this child Krishna, who was this world famous butter thief, you see, and who was at that point of time trying to convince his mother that no, I didn't eat the makhan, which is the butter, and that whole imagery is almost impossible for someone who would not have had, let's say, the gift of sight as the world knows it. How did he even conjure these images? This sort of rich kind of alankar with which he sees Krishna and imagines the entire Vrindavan, and so that compared to what you just now mentioned about Narsinh Mehta,
right,
that was sort of. You didn't need those rich literature to come to you through texts or the traditional methods of education for some of these obviously gifted people.
Right.
But it was something beyond themselves.
Right.
And that, I think is, that lends that sort of magic as well.
It does.
Maybe
It
a
does.
school limited them.
Right. I think once again, I'm speculating. These are the themes that I've often thought about. When you have any kind of disability that we're talking about, perhaps nature gives you something which is heightened in a different area. For instance, someone like Surdas, who didn't have the gift of sight, as you point out, perhaps that freed him up from trying to match his imagination with the reality that he could see. So he just let himself go completely. And in
Yeah,
the process, for any artist, when you let yourself go,
yeah,
you see absolutely stunning results. History is littered with painters and writers and poets and people who just let themselves go
exactly.
without being bound by the traditional definitions of what is creative. They
Yeah,
produce amazing stuff. I think it's perhaps true of Narsinh Mehta too.
yeah. And who was it who said, "Heard melodies are sweet; those unheard are sweeter." So there is certainly a treat when the senses. It's really beyond that construct of what our senses perceive, which is of course the beauty of the song. But let me now come to how you chose to actually make a film on this song. What was that trigger?
So we grew up with, like you said, Vaishnav Jan To playing in the background from my childhood. It was always on the radio. And the version that we used to hear is the more rustic version that I play in my documentary,
Yeah,
composed by an inmate of the Gandhi ashram. Unfortunately, I think he was a Maharashtrian gentleman, I forget his name, but he was the one who constructed. And it sounds very rustic. It's almost as if some shepherd is singing at
yeah,
the crack of dawn,
yes.
but it still has a very captivating melody to it. And I don't know, yeah,
Truth be told, I liked that version even better than the common version that we
it
know.
is. It is.
Yeah, yeah, because it's got some sort of an authenticity.
Yeah, it is. It's almost as if Narsinh Mehta would have sung like that.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah,
So, coming back to, since it was always in my subconscious, it was about 20 odd years ago that I began to think in terms of telling the story of someone who created such an extraordinary body of work. In any other country, if he had written in English, for instance, he would have been an absolutely world class figure. Because he wrote in Gujarati or an Indian language, it was necessarily limited. But I
right.
regard Narsinh Mehta as an absolutely world class poet and philosopher. I mentioned philosophy because there is another song that I have included in this documentary. To me, which my favorite song of his, which is Jagine Jo To Jagat Dise Nahi,
Yeah,
Ungma Atpata Bhog Bhase. The loose translation would be when I wake up, the world disappears. The idea that you wake up and find that the world has disappeared, it is
yeah,
profound.
it is.
He said, but when I'm asleep, I have this weird visions of reality. So here is a man who knows how to turn things on their head. Jagine jo to jagat dise nahi ungma atpata bhog bhase. And then at one point he writes, once again, I'm going to cite in Gujarati because that's the language.
Please do,
Chit
please.
Chit Chaitanya Viras Tadrup Che Brahma Latka Kare Brahma Pase. Now, Brahma is obviously existence, it's Srishti, it is the universe. Narsinh Mehta's point of view is that the universe is so preoccupied with itself, it keeps itself entertained. We are incidental to its entertainment. Brahma latka kare Brahma. I'm quite completely struck by that idea that the universe is preoccupied, self-obsessed with itself,
Yeah,
and maybe we just look at the spectacle and be happy. That's the whole. So
yeah,
here's a man who could straddle such a vast spectrum of philosophical construct. Like I mentioned, he addressed both Sagun and Nirgun poetry, which is again very rare.
Yeah.
Poets are known to stick to one and not go to the other.
Yeah, I think it needs to be explained to anybody who may not know that Sagun is a physical one, Nirgun is more the abstract form of poetry. And I think it's an important distinction you make because, for instance, someone like Kabir would completely go on the Nirgun part.
Right.
Somebody who is so celebrated for again his stream of thought. But whereas here is Narsinh Mehta and 15th century. And where do where would he have been drawing that from? Like, who are today you can say who are we reading and who are the ones who are influencing us?
Right.
Any idea, Mayank? So,
the speculation. Yeah.
In a course of research, what exactly did you come up with?
From my conversations with a lot of people, and plus having read him quite a bit, my broad conclusion is that it was entirely spontaneous to him. He was a natural born poet. I think he perhaps thought only in poetic terms. He was so strong in his imagery all the time that I'm sure he had problems adjusting to the mundane world that he was surrounded with, including the fact that you mentioned the oppressive nature of the caste structure, ironically, despite the fact that he was at the top of the totem pole.
Yeah.
I mean, Nagars, even today in Gujarat, people look at them with a great deal of fascination. I've experienced it myself. I find it absurd that people talk about these things, but I'll give you a small example. Sorry for the digression. I'm not going to name that particular sect that I'm referring to here. I have a friend whose son is mixed. Partly he's from the Nagar community, partly he's not. And he grew up being told by his mother all the time about how great the Nagars are. And he used to ask me, the person was born here, so that's why I'm mentioning this. And he used to ask me, he said, what's the fuss about Nagars? I said, first of all, just dismiss it. It's nonsense. I personally don't believe in that nonsense, but maybe someday I'll illustrate why people think what they think. And as it so happened that we were invited by a fairly well-known religious, spiritual sort of figure from Gujarat who was visiting this area. And he was surrounded by his younger swamis. And I knew some of them. So while my friend's father went to see this chief swami, I had met him and I had no interest in conversing with him. So I was waiting outside and talking to these young monks. And I was introduced as a journalist and to one of the monks who was born in England, by the way.
I see.
So he says, he looks at me, his face lit up like a Christmas tree.
I see.
He said, Chhaya. I said, yeah. He said, Chhaya means you're Nagar. And I didn't know how to respond to that. Genuinely, I said, I mean, this guy is a monk. He has renounced these worldly classifications. He shouldn't be concerned about those things at all.
Yeah.
Yet he's asking me if I'm Nagar. I said, if you believe in those sorts of things, you can say yes. And he was overcome with having met someone who was from that community, and then he moved on. My young friend was sitting right next to me, and he noticed that. I said, just think about it. Here is a man who is a monk, who has renounced the world. He's not interested in worldly things, and yet he responds to a member of this community the way he responded.
Right.
You can imagine he went straight to the heads of this Naga community, and that explains why Narsinh Mehta was excommunicated by.
Yeah. That also, of course, that was because that he embraced what was, or at least the community that were then referred to as untouchables.
Absolutely.
So, this is the reason why he invited the wrath of his upper caste and highest caste community. Now, that thread, though, is of course a familiar one. We in Karnataka itself, Mayank, we have this absolutely great social reformer, Saint Basaveshwara. And even for those who may not be familiar with Basava's teachings, would be familiar with the word Lingayat, simply because it has been so much in the political spectrum of news in the past few years, even outside Karnataka, across India, right? So, but then when you examine the life of Basava, he also came from the almost the highest social order. He was his father was a Brahmin, and yet he revolted against the same Brahminical order. And in so much so that he said that you do, I mean, the temples that distinguish between the upper caste and the outcaste is not a temple that he would want to worship at. And therefore he propagated, and I'm talking about the 13th century, a couple of 100 years before Narsinh Mehta, where he advocates the use of individual lingas and some of the beautiful Kannada poetry that actually flows from saying that, those who cannot construct those temples, you have the linga right within you, you see. And so in the context of Narsinh Mehta himself, I would like to just read out a little bit of that, Ullavaru Shivalaya it is called. And I think it's a great excuse for us also to think about that sort of tradition, which where you had these saints who came from this so-called upper sect, but who revolted against that same thing and, created such a great social order. But I think it's also a parallel tragedy that that the world slips back into the same rubbish of casteism. So I'll just come back to that bit. But, here we are talking about Basaveshwara, and he said that the rich will make temples for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head a cupola of gold. Listen, O Lord Kudala Sangama, which is what he referred Shiva as, things standing shall fall, but the moving ever shall stay. This is Basavanna, translated by the noted, celebrated poet A.K. Ramanujan.
That's extraordinary.
And so please go on about
interesting. You should mention the grotesque nomenclature which still continues in some quarters of India, the so-called untouchables. In Narsinh Mehta's time, we're talking about nearly 600 years ago, the idea that someone born in that particular community, in a small village, could not just hobnob, but be part of that experience all the time. Sing, go to their settlements and sing with them, and essentially be one of them. Horrified the Nagars, and I find it laughable that they thought of themselves as some superior beings.
Yeah.
It is in that context that Narsinh Mehta coined the term Harijan. People don't realize that Harijan that Gandhi used was coined by Narsinh Mehta as Harina Jan. That's how he describes it. And it became Harijan. So Gandhi has taken two very important constructs from Narsinh Mehta.
Yeah.
Vaishnava Jan To and Harina Jan Harijan. Entire sensibility.
Your film has an extensive conversation with the Mahatma's great grandson, Gandhiji Singh, and the fact that he mentions Tushar Gandhi mentions about how even in their family it's been a tradition to have prayers. And Vaishnav Jan To, there's no fixed date or year that it must have entered his psyche. And what it means to him, like to many other Gujaratis. And so one imagines that that's how the Mahatma came to adopt it, and adopt it like how?
Right. No, interesting. Once again, it was, of course, Gandhi grew up with that. But in terms of his daily ritual, he had this a set of prayers and songs that he used to have even in South Africa before he returned to India. This was introduced sometime in 1907. Vaishnava Jan To became part of the set of songs.
So he was still a barrister.
Sorry?
Gandhiji was still a barrister.
He was, and this is at Phoenix, the famous ashram in South Africa.
Right.
It was in 1907 that he introduced Vaishnava Jan To as one of the songs that must be sung. And then it quickly rose to become his moral compass, as I point out in the documentary. And it remained so throughout his life. And you can see that he tried to lead his own life in accordance with much of what Vaishnav Jan To so brilliantly lays down without being dogmatic or without being even spiritual. It's not a spiritual song. If you think about what Mehta says,
Yeah.
there's nothing even remotely religious or dogmatic or spiritual about it. It's a
And I think
straightforward moral
that's
conduct.
also the reason, yeah, the reason why it's so universal and it's not just to followers of a certain faith, is because you can apply it to anywhere, any
Right.
geography, any race.
Yeah, it is. And Dr. Tridib Sharud, who is a very well-known Gandhi scholar in Gujarat, he points out that if the Gujarati language had created just one song, namely Vaishnava Jan To,
Yeah.
that would have been enough to just end the language. It was that great a song that this seemingly unlettered man wrote over 5 centuries ago. I think earlier you had raised a point about how people don't realize that Gandhi did not write the song, and it's a serious problem. 9 out of 10 told me that they thought Gandhi wrote it,
Yeah.
and Gandhi, being Gandhi, his engagement with literature was very specific. He was not engaging with Narsinh Mehta in that sense. Once again, Dr. Sharud points out very insightfully in the documentary
Right.
that he engaged with the song and not the writer of the song.
Hmm.
Could have been written by someone else entirely. That was not Gandhi's interest.
Yeah.
Gandhi was not drawn to the person of the poet, but the poetry of the poet. That's the point, and that's why he took it and ran with it with such manifest success.
You see, a little bit now about how difficult was it for you to, or was it tough at all for you to actually make the film? Did you travel from the US to, and you kind of zeroed in on location? So, and of course, what's that journey been like? I mean, and did it change anything in you about your perception of Narsinh Mehta and what you had known about the poet and his song?
To answer the last question first, it merely reconfirmed what one already felt about him. Uh, Especially when I went to Taraja, where he was born near Bhavnagar. And I went around the area where he was born and went to that hill that I mentioned. Uh, it's a lava sort of hill, like Mount Girnar is also part of that eruption some
Yeah.
65 million years ago. So that it confirmed to me what I had thought of him. That's my short answer to the second question. The first being in terms of journeying from here to there, one obviously runs into financial problems. But I have to extremely gratefully acknowledge three people, one of whom does not want to be named.
Okay.
He lives here. The second, of course, is my nephew, who is in the Middle East. His name is Tapan Vaidya. He is my first cousin's son, so he's my nephew. He's almost, I think, not that much younger than me, but technically he's my nephew. He was extremely enthusiastic in underwriting a lot of the cost. And there is another gentleman here called Dayabhai Prajapati, who's lived in this country for a long time. And the third person, like I said, he was perhaps more generous than the other two. He does not want to be named. But between the three, I managed to produce it, but I've not been able to sell it. And that's the reason why I am now releasing it free on YouTube.
But I think, Mayank, that is what it comes to. And that's the irony that a country of his birth, a country of the birth of the Mahatma and of the song that influenced the Mahatma and the song creator, and in the 150th year of the Mahatma's anniversary that we are celebrating, is it not possible for the government to showcase this important film? Why is it so difficult? I mean, we all we all know as Indians the sort of meshings of bureaucracy. But did you actually approach people
I did approach a lot of people, including the late Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj, whom I knew reasonably well while I was posted in Delhi. You might remember that the government created this sort of international affair by having singers from around the world sing Vaishnav Jan To. They probably spent maybe $500,000, maybe $1 million. It was a slickly produced video to celebrate the 150th year of Gandhi without even remotely acknowledging that Narsinh Mehta wrote it. And
Oh,
they produced this video where you have African singers and Middle Eastern singers, and they're all singing with great enthusiasm this song. And I reached out to her, I reached out to the Prime Minister's Twitter handle several times. Forget helping. They didn't even have the basic decency to say no. And it's equally true of the Gujarat government. They just couldn't care less. I don't know what the problem was. I wasn't asking for a lot of money. I wasn't even asking for money, by the way. I was asking for some kind of traction through their Twitter handle if they could push it.
yes,
And I was not surprised because there is still a draw that people have for those who come from elsewhere and not from India when it comes to projects like this. So, for instance, if I were an American doing it or an Englishman
yes.
doing it, perhaps it would have got a greater traction.
This is so. I mean, it's funny and yet it's so not funny. It's an irony that is. You wonder what would it take for the government to really finally acknowledge, because these are the days of hyper nationalism in our country, and this ticks so many boxes, and yet you see a filmmaker who's given so much and made it so authentically could not find the support of his own government. I think that's something which is. So what do you now plan to do with this, Mayank? How would you ensure that this really reaches the many Indians and many outside Indians as well that deserve to see this?
Yeah, the only option, like I said, I'm about to premiere it on YouTube, my channel. Not that I'm expecting it to suddenly shoot up and draw hundreds of thousands of viewers at all. I mean, these days people make reaction videos. I'm sure you're familiar with reaction videos. They are so staggeringly silly, where these youngsters watch somebody else's creation in a little picture-in-picture window on YouTube and have some silly reaction. They build up million and a half followers by doing something so trite. So
Right.
I don't expect people to watch my documentary much at all. I would be happy if 15 people watched it. But that's not my game. I'm far too much steeped into my detachment to worry about that. But I want to put it out there for the simple reason that Narsinh Mehta deserves it. Not that he would have cared had he been alive.
Yeah.
But people should recognize that it was not Gandhi who wrote the song. It's ironic that I had to call it Gandhi's song to prove the point, which is exactly to the contrary of what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say. But Gandhi is a brand name. It cannot be.
Yeah.
So, and he was the one who made it popular. Again, that's undeniable. So it's ironic, but hopefully with some name recognition, some people might choose to watch this documentary.
You see, if you had titled this documentary, just occurs to me that if you had said not Gandhi's song, then you see these days, this is the age, Mayank Chhaya, of clickbait headlines.
Right.
And you with, let's say, the good old traditional methods of journalism headlines have not been able to make a dent with the government.
Agreed. But once again, I keep falling back to his writing. There is another one where it's almost quantum mechanical in its underpinnings.
Yeah.
He writes, Narsinh Mehta writes, "Hu khare tu kharo, hu vina tu nahi." That means you exist. He is addressing perhaps Krishna or even Shiv. He says, you exist because I exist. If I don't exist, you don't exist. That's the staggering conceit of an extraordinary poet.
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it reminds me of the idea in quantum mechanics that
right.
the reality becomes reality by the act of observation at quantum mechanical level.
Yeah,
It's 600 years ago, Narsinh Mehta was perhaps by default implying that very concept. I mean, it's staggering. I'm
right.
so, once you look at the subject from that angle,
Yeah.
you couldn't give a rat's ass whether people come and watch your documentary.
I think there is something of Narsinh Mehta that should rub off on the maker of this film, and I too concur with you that sometimes, especially when you're made a film on some absolutely higher uplifting thought, you almost are so I don't know whether world weary is the term, but you're like, fine, I've made this, and then it's now it's gone.
Yeah.
Beyond it'll reach those it does have to reach.
Right. You talked about things having rubbed off. I think what has certainly rubbed off without any qualification whatsoever is Narsinh Mehta's lifelong penury.
I see.
That level of impoverishment has rubbed off. I mean, things that you see around are not a consequence of my earnings at all. These are I'm here in this small apartment courtesy of my wonderful son, Jashan. Otherwise, this documentary has really set me back financially like nobody's business. So I think there's some poetic justice in the fact that Narsinh Mehta died a pauper. Perhaps that would be true of me too.
I really wish that the similarity or parallel lines between the maker and the muse really ends before that. I really wish that there is. I mean, it
I
doesn't.
have zero hope, but nice of you to say. And the only other similarity that I can think of is that I've been a poet since the age of 13, and even if I say so myself, see that's where conceit comes in. What I write is world class. I will have zero hesitation in saying that. On my good days, what I produce is absolutely world class. On other days, it is humdrum, and I know it is humdrum. But my humdrum would be about 5 to 10%. The rest is not. So that is one bridge that I have to the great Narsinh Mehta.
Well, Mayank, I think it's really this sort of parallels that's drawn between today's journalist who's one round detached from the world, and of course that generation's poet. So it's really interesting this sort of conversation. But let me ask you this: that as the film premieres and more and more people hopefully know what it is. Is there something which is in the making? You're planning to with the same amount. I mean, you can say that okay, penury, but then there are people who have supported you in this venture. So do you want to make a parallel film on another inspiring unsung character?
India abounds in figures like this. I mean, I don't know of any other country where the quality of literature is as diverse, as rich, as profound as anywhere on the planet. And I'm not saying it as someone these days, the fashion is to say those things. I've been saying it since the age of perhaps 9 or 10, because I began to warm up to those things early on. You asked me about one's familiarity with the English language, because there were books in my household. Yeah. People were all readers, so one was exposed to great literature. And I can tell you that there are figures like, say, for instance, Padma Sambhava, who is regarded as the second Buddha.
Right.
If you read what they wrote, it is, I mean, you can't wrap your head around it. For most people, it would be impossible. It is so esoteric. So these days, when I find these nationalist fools saying things without really reading anything, at least spend 15 minutes of your day on reading what should give you legitimate pride about what the Indian civilization has been. Panine's grammar, for instance.
Right.
Bhartrihari's Vairagya Shatakam. These are profound pieces of writing.
Yeah.
Buddha, of course, forget Buddha. Buddha was a completely different league altogether. I mean, anyone who could think in terms of impermanence has basically won the day.
Yeah.
There is nothing more to say after impermanence, really, in my book. That's why you have these Buddhist monks creating very intricate mandalas and then destroying it to underscore the idea of impermanence. Find me another philosophy that tells you that. Kshanika, the idea of kshanika,
Yeah.
from moment to moment to moment, that's your existence. And
Yeah.
then somebody like Kumarila Bhatta was a scholar, I think, I forget the era. His question was, if Buddha talks about kshanika, as in moments to moments, what is between two moments? Now,
Hmm.
it's a question that was raised hundreds of years ago by some obscure scholar. That is the
Yeah.
richness of India that I would like to capture someday.
That's right. And in fact, some of those, at least concepts, if not philosophies, can really help us tide through even such a thing as lockdown. Like if you really borrow from the concept of being a sthita prajna, which is really to not be carried away by joy nor not plunge into sorrow, which the Ramayana quotes, which so many of our ancient texts borrow from. And then I think we are really sorted in that sense. We don't need to even look outside. But
Exactly.
I would say that for bringing such poet who was otherwise out of our reach and so many centuries back, and for reminding us that who the Mahatma drew his inspiration from was not a song of his own composition, but of such a great poet. For actually making this film, despite all these circumstances that you mentioned, uh, here is an applause on behalf of everybody who's going to watch this film. I
Thank you so
certainly,
much.
yes, I certainly will make sure that my circle knows about it, and of course, then it's up to them whether they are lucky enough to derive from your film. All I can say is that I was very excited about interviewing you on this particular topic, and which is why I thought I should be in khadi no less, and then Vardha, so I can wear something very historic. This is from the Mahatma Gandhi Sevagram ashram and the kind of
Right.
cooperative there. So I think let's just celebrate what we have from our own country and from our past. And thank you so much, Mayank Chhaya, for doing what you've done. And
No,
all
I'm truly touched, Vasanthi, for this conversation. Like I said, it's an awkward thing for a journalist behind the scenes to be interviewed, but I'm glad that it was you who was doing the interviewing and not someone else. You mentioned Sthita Prajna, so I'll end on this note that the idea of Sthita Prajna has traveled so deeply in the Indian psyche without often people realizing it. The great song from Hamdono that Sahir wrote and people routinely
वो मैं
sing,
जिंदगी का साथ निभाता चला गया.
that is nothing but Sthita Prajna. गम और खुशी में फर्क न महसूस हो जहां मैं दिल को उस मकाम पे. Now, the idea that you no longer recognize or make a distinction between happiness and sorrow, you
Yeah,
reach that exalted state.
yeah.
That is Sthita Prajna, equanimity. So let's be equanimous and see if people watch it, fine. If they don't, equally fine.
Do you feel like humming a song in party?
Well,
No, you're a composer as well. That's another simile with Narsinh Mehta, let's say.
we are both notorious for being completely uninhibited singers online. You, of course, have a great tone. So I was singing a song, Ulfat Mein Zamane Ki Har Rasm Ko Thukra, before this interview because my throat was not behaving very well. So I don't know if you know that song.
No, please. Yeah, you're the one who's going to introduce it.
I'm going to do a little bit of karaoke if you don't mind.
Please.
कदमों को न रोकेगी जंजीर बातों की हम तोड़ के निकलेंगे दीवार समाजों की दूरी पे सही मंजिल दूरी से मैं घबराऊं, उल्फत में जमाने की हर रस्म को ठुकराऊं.
Wow.
That's it.
उल्फत में जमाने की हर रस्म को ठुकराओ.
Gee.
अच्छा.
I mean, this was a random song for a Narsinh Mehta documentary, but I have this karaoke obsession. I'm sure you know because of my film.
Yeah. See, for the song itself, all that they need to do is to watch a documentary. So it was only good that you chose something else. On that musical note, here is to more and more recognition and more celebration of that
That's very
incredible
generous of
poet,
you.
Atma Karnas.
I'm truly touched. Thank you for your time, Vasanthi, and look forward to more interaction about what you do next.
Thank you. Namaskara from Bangalore.
Namaskara from Chicago. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.